Picture this. It's 2011, and there's this 24-year-old woman from Perth, Australia, and she's standing on the beach in Maui, desperately trying to learn kitesurfing. She's never done this sport before in her life, and frankly, it terrifies her. The wind is howling, the board keeps slipping away from her, and she's getting absolutely pummeled by waves. But here's the thing, she isn't here for fun. She's here because some of the world's most powerful tech investors happen to love this extreme sport, and she needs their money to build what she believes will be the future of design. Now, this woman, she's already been rejected by over 100 investors. 100. They've told her that her idea is too big, that she's too young, and that nobody from Australia could possibly build a global tech company. They've said that Adobe's stranglehold on design software is unbreakable, that her vision of making design accessible to everyone is naive. But Melanie Perkins has something that her rejectors don't understand yet, an unshakable belief that the world's most complex problems often have beautifully simple solutions. And you know what? She's willing to do whatever it takes, even learning how to kitesurf in shark-infested waters while battling seasickness to prove them wrong. So there she is, struggling to stay upright on that kiteboard, getting thrown around by the Pacific Ocean, and she has absolutely no idea that the connections she's making at this retreat will help her build one of the most valuable startups in the world, that her impossible vision will eventually serve 185 million users across 190 countries, that she'll become one of the youngest female tech billionaires in history, running a company worth $40 billion, more valuable than most Fortune 500 companies. The woman getting battered by those waves in Maui, she's about to revolutionize how the world thinks about design, creativity, and accessibility. But first, she needs to survive this kitesurfing lesson. Welcome to Inflection Moments. I'm David Franklin, and you and I are about to dive into something fascinating. You know that moment when everything changes for an entrepreneur? When one decision, one pivot, or one breakthrough suddenly shifts their entire trajectory. That is what we're hunting for today. If you're building something, if you're that founder grinding it out, making those impossible decisions that keep you up at night, this episode is for you. Because today, we're going inside the mind of one of the most successful entrepreneurs in history to uncover the exact moments that transform their journey from ordinary to extraordinary. Here's what we're doing. We're dissecting the 5 most pivotal inflection points in their career, but most importantly, we're uncovering the strategic thinking behind each decision, the kind of insight that separates the builders from the dreamers. Ready? Let's get started. You know, I'm fascinated by entrepreneurs who see the world differently. Not just people who build successful companies, but those rare individuals who look at entire industries and say, this is completely backwards and there has to be a better way. Melanie Perkins is exactly that kind of entrepreneur. When I first heard about Melanie's story, what struck me wasn't just that she built Canva into a design empire, it was how she spotted an opportunity that was hiding in plain sight. So picture this, it's 2007, and she's teaching graphic design to university students. She's watching them struggle for entire semesters just to learn where the buttons were in Photoshop. It was like watching someone try to perform surgery with a sledgehammer. The tools were powerful, sure, but they were built for professionals who had years to master their complexity. Melanie sees this daily frustration and asks a simple question. What if design could be as easy as using Google Docs? That question would eventually reshape an entire industry. But here's what makes her story so compelling to me. She didn't start by trying to take down Adobe. Instead, she started in her mother's living room in Perth, Australia, building a drag-and-drop tool for high school yearbooks. She proved her concept in the smallest possible market before daring to dream bigger. Today, we're going to explore the 5 pivotal moments that transform Melanie from a frustrated design teacher into the CEO of one of the world's most valuable private companies. These aren't just business milestones, they're decision points where she chose to think differently than almost everyone around her. We'll see how a 19-year-old university dropout convinced her family to loan her $50,000 for a business idea they didn't understand. How she turned 100 consecutive investor rejections into a masterclass in persistence and iteration. How she learned an extreme sport she was terrified of because that's where the money was. How she hired her future co-founder by stalking him on Facebook and creating a fairy tale presentation about his potential adventure. And how she chose to give away most of her billions while still in her 30s because she believes wealth is something you're merely custodian of. These moments reveal something profound about entrepreneurial thinking. Sometimes, the biggest opportunities come from solving the most basic human frustrations. Sometimes the best strategy is just to start impossibly small, and sometimes the most successful people are those willing to do things that make them deeply uncomfortable in service of what they believe in. All right, let's get started with the first key inflection point here. Let me take you back to 2006, to a computer lab at the University of Western Australia. Melanie is 19 years old at this point, and she's studying communications, psychology, and commerce. She's also working part-time as a multimedia technical assistant and tutor, helping students learn design programs like Adobe Photoshop, InDesign, and Dreamweaver. Picture this scene. It's another Tuesday afternoon, and Melanie is sitting next to a student who's been staring at the Photoshop interface for 20 minutes. This student, let's just call him Will, he just wants to create a simple poster for a school event. Nothing fancy, just some text, maybe a photo, some basic shapes. The kind of thing that should take 10 minutes. But Will, he's lost, completely lost. He's trying to figure out layers, masks, vector paths, color profiles. It's like he's been handed the controls to a space shuttle when all he wanted was to ride a bike. Melanie watches as his frustration builds. She can see it in his shoulders, the way they tense up. She can hear it in his voice as he mutters under his breath, "This is ridiculous," Will says. And Melanie, she knows exactly what he means. In that moment, watching student after student struggle with these overcomplicated tools, Melanie starts to envision something different. So Melanie later describes this realization. She says, people would have to spend an entire semester learning where the buttons were, and that seemed completely ridiculous. I thought that in the future it was all going to be online and collaborative and much simpler than these really hard tools. What Melanie desired wasn't just easier software. She wanted to fundamentally change who could be a designer in the first place. Adobe had built tools for professionals, people willing to invest months or years learning complex interfaces. But what about everyone else? What about the small business owner who just needed a flyer? The teacher who wanted to make a beautiful presentation? Or the student trying to create a yearbook page? She envisions a world where design could be as simple as typing in Word or editing in Google Docs. Drag, drop, done. No instruction manuals, no complicated layers, and no professional training required. But here's the problem. Melanie wasn't a programmer. She didn't have any experience building software. She's a 19-year-old communication student with exactly zero tech industry connections and no money. Adobe was a multi-billion-dollar company with thousands of engineers and decades of market dominance. The idea that a teenager from Perth could challenge their empire seemed absurd. Even more challenging was the fact that professional designers actually liked complexity. They wore their Photoshop mastery like a badge of honor. Suggesting that design should be simple and accessible was almost insulting to people who had spent years developing their technical skills. And let's be honest, the market wasn't asking for this solution. Students complained about Photoshop, sure, but they assumed that was just the price of doing design work. It's like complaining about traffic while never imagining someone might invent a better transportation system. Melanie faced the classic innovator's dilemma. She was seeing a problem that most people had accepted as just the way things are. So what does Melanie do? She makes the decision that defines her entire approach to entrepreneurship. Instead of trying to solve the whole problem at once, she starts with the tiniest possible slice of it. She doesn't try to build Photoshop but easier. She doesn't attempt to take on Adobe directly. Instead, she identifies one specific use case where the pain was most acute: school yearbooks. Think about this choice for a moment. Yearbooks are typically created by volunteers, like students, teachers, parents, all of whom have zero design experience, but need to create something that looks professional and will be treasured for decades. They were using the same complex tools that professional designers used, but they didn't need 95% of those features. They just need templates, drag and drop functionality, and the ability to collaborate online. This is Melanie's genius insight. She would prove her vision worked in the smallest, most constrained market before dreaming bigger. In 2007, at age 19, Melanie dropped out of university to co-found Fusion Books with her boyfriend, Cliff Obrecht. They convinced her family to loan them $50,000 and hired a development company to build their drag-and-drop yearbook platform. The results were both immediate and validating. In their first year, 16 schools signed up. Schools loved it because it made their yearbook creation collaborative and simple. Students could upload their photos and contribute to pages, and teachers could oversee the process without needing to master complex software. But more importantly, Fusion Books becomes Melanie's lab for understanding the user experience, online collaboration, and the technical challenges of building design software. Every feature they built, every user complaint they solved, Every process they streamlined was preparing her for something much, much bigger. As Fusion Books grow, eventually becoming Australia's largest yearbook company and expanding to France and New Zealand, Melanie was quietly learning how to build the future of design. But she never lost sight of her original vision. This was about proving that design could be accessible to people on a much bigger scale. Years later, reflecting on this decision, Melanie says, "We've been able to build every brick intentionally. By starting small and building methodically, she avoids the classic startup mistake of trying to boil the ocean. Instead, she creates a foundation that could support something much more ambitious. That frustrated afternoon in the computer lab had planted a seed, and that decision to start with yearbooks allows that seed to grow. But Melanie's biggest challenges are still ahead." By 2010, Fusion Books was humming along nicely. They had hundreds of school books as customers, the business is profitable, and honestly, Melanie could have been content running Australia's largest yearbook company. But she couldn't shake this bigger vision. Every day she's spending building Fusion Books, she's thinking about much bigger things. Picture the conference scene. It's 2010, and there's a startup competition happening in Perth. Now, Perth isn't exactly Silicon Valley. It's on the other side of the world, and it's in Western Australia, which is the only major city on Australia's west coast, and thousands of miles from the hustle and bustle of Australia's business community on the east coast. But there's one person in the audience who doesn't belong in Perth. Bill Tai, a legendary VC investor from Silicon Valley who had invested in companies like Zoom, who was visiting to judge the competition. After the event, during the networking session, Melanie spots her opportunity. She approaches Bill, the legendary investor who normally wouldn't give someone like her the time of day, and somehow manages to engage him in conversation for exactly 5 minutes. Melanie later recalls this moment. "I spoke to him for 5 minutes, and he said if I went to San Francisco, he'd be happy to meet with me. So I jumped on a plane to San Francisco." Now imagine the audacity of this moment. 23-year-old woman from Perth with no Silicon Valley connections and no warm intros gets 5 minutes with a top-tier VC and somehow convince him to meet with her in his home territory. What Melanie wanted in that moment was simple but bold. She wanted to pitch her vision for the future of design to someone who had the power to fund it. Not just Fusion Books, but her real idea. A platform that would make design accessible to everyone, not just professional designers or students making yearbooks. She envisioned a world where anyone could create beautiful graphics, presentations, social media posts, business cards, anything visual, with the same ease that they typed a document. She wanted to take the entire design ecosystem, stock photos, templates, fonts, layout tools, things like that, and integrate them into one simple online platform. This wasn't about building a better Photoshop. This was about reimagining what design software could be if you started from scratch with normal people as your primary users instead of as an afterthought. But here's the massive problem Melanie faces. How do you convince a Silicon Valley investor that a 23-year-old woman from Perth with a yearbook business should be funded to take on Adobe, one of the most entrenched software companies in the world? Every conventional startup wisdom works against her. She isn't technical. She isn't based in Silicon Valley. She doesn't have an MBA or precious startup experience. Her current business was in yearbooks, which wasn't exactly a sexy tech category. And she's proposing to democratize an industry built around high standards of professionalism. The cultural gap is enormous too. Here she was, preparing to pitch to investors who are used to Stanford PhDs with intricate technical architectures and detailed market analysis. She's going to propose something that sounds almost naive in its simplicity. What if design was easy? This is where Melanie makes one of the most unconventional decisions in startup history. Instead of creating a sleek digital presentation or trying to mimic the polished decks she thought investors expected, she went completely old school. She creates a paper pitch deck, not a PowerPoint, not a keynote, an actual physical printed on paper flipbook. So Melanie later laughs at this. She says, "I actually printed that on my printing presses and I tied it up with some beautiful ribbon and it said the future of publishing and it's incredibly talky." She goes, "But I think that was kind of funny. I don't think many people pitch on paper pitch decks, but this wasn't quirkiness for its own sake. This was just being different. In a world where every entrepreneur is trying to out-tech each other with fancy presentations, Melanie chooses to be memorable. She chose to demonstrate that sometimes the most powerful communication happens when you strip away all the digital layers and just connect person to person." The pitch deck itself was comprehensive. She had put, in her words, every single idea I could possibly imagine into her vision for the future of publishing. But the format sends a message. Melanie thinks differently. She isn't afraid to stand out. She believes in her vision so completely that she's willing to look a fool for it. And I think you see that trend again and again with entrepreneurs who make it to the highest levels of success. They have such conviction in their ideas that they're willing to look a fool while doing it. The meeting happened at a cafe on University Avenue in Palo Alto. Melanie sat across from Bill Tai with her paper pitch deck, tied with ribbon, trying to convince the Silicon Valley legend that her vision for design could become a multi-billion-dollar company. She doesn't get funding from that meeting. Bill doesn't write her a check or immediately connect her with other investors. But something more valuable happened. He took her seriously. He's like, "Where's your team? You got to get a tech team," Melanie remembers. More importantly, Bill invites her into his network, specifically his Mai Tai global community, which brings together athletes, conservationists, technologists, artists, and innovators. This is where the kitesurfing comes in. Bill's network gathers around extreme sports, particularly kitesurfing. If she wanted access to the investors and potential co-founders in Bill's orbit, she needs to learn how to kitesurf. So Melanie explains this. Every time he would say, "How's my business going?" he'd also be like, "How's your kitesurfing going?" So I kind of needed to learn how to kitesurf. I hadn't done it before, and to be honest, it's not something that I would normally naturally try. She goes on and says, "But yeah, decided to give it a go because when you don't have any connections, you don't have any network, you just kind of have to wedge your foot in the door and wiggle it all the way through." The paper pitch deck had done exactly what it needed to do. It opened a door, not to immediate funding, but to a network of people who would eventually help her build what she envisioned. Sometimes the most important result of a pitch isn't the money. It's access to the right people who believe in your vision enough to help you make it real. That paper pitch deck, tied with ribbon, had started something that would eventually become worth $40 billion. But first, Melanie needs to learn how to kitesurf. Moving on to the third key inflection point now. Getting funding was huge, but Melanie quickly realizes she has a new problem. How do you convince a star Google engineer to leave his comfortable job and join two Australians with a crazy idea about democratizing design? It's 2012, and Cameron Adams is living what most people consider a dream life. He's working at Google in Sydney, collaborating with the legendary Rasmussen brothers, the creators of Google Maps, on cutting-edge projects. He's got job security, stock options, and the prestige of working for one of the world's most admired companies. Meanwhile, Melanie and Cliff are in Perth with their yearbook business and a vision that sounds almost naive. "We want to make design as easy as using Google Docs." They have some seed funding, but they're still essentially unknown entrepreneurs asking an established Google engineer to bet his career on their idea. The introduction comes through Lars Rasmussen, but an introduction is just an opening. Cameron had been approached by countless startups before. Why should he care about this one? Someone who understands both the complexity of building design software and the user experience challenges of making it simple. She needs someone who shares her vision that design tools could be fundamentally reimagined. But more than that, she needs Cameron to want to join them. She can't just hire him as a consultant or an employee. She needs him to be a co-founder, to believe in the vision so completely that he'd be willing to give up his Google salary and a comfortable life to build something from scratch. This isn't about recruiting an employee. This is about finding a founding partner who'd share the incredible highs and devastating lows of building a company. Someone who'd work 80-hour weeks, survive on pizza and caffeine, and maintain faith in the vision even when everything seemed to be falling apart. Cameron's skeptical at this point, and rightfully so. He'd seen plenty of entrepreneurs with big dreams and limited understanding of the technical challenges involved. Building design software isn't just about having a good idea. It's about solving incredibly complex engineering problems around image rendering, file formats, collaboration, performance, and scalability. So Cameron later talks about this. He says, "I had a startup in Sydney before meeting Melanie and Cliff and decided to help them build the beginnings of Canva. He was already an entrepreneur. He doesn't necessarily need to join someone else's company. Plus, Cameron understands the design software market better than most people. He knew how entrenched Adobe was, how comfortable professional designers were with their complex tools, and how difficult it would be to change decades of industry habits. The technical challenges alone are daunting. How do you build software that's simultaneously powerful enough for professionals and simple enough for complete beginners?" The opportunity cost was significant too. At Google, Cameron was working on products used by millions of people with unlimited resources and brilliant colleagues. Why would he give that up for a risky startup that might fail? This is where Melanie did something that was either brilliant or completely insane, depending on your perspective. Instead of just sending Cameron a standard recruiting email or making a formal presentation, she does something completely unexpected. She goes to Cameron's Facebook profile and downloads his photos. She then creates what she calls this hilarious fairy tale that told the story of the amazing adventure Cameron would have if he joined their company. Think about that for a moment. Facebook stalking someone you barely knew and using their personal photos in a recruitment presentation would have seemed incredibly strange to most people. It was the kind of thing that could have backfired spectacularly. Cameron could have been creeped out, offended, or simply just dismissive. But Melanie understands something important about human psychology. People want to be part of a story larger than themselves. By creating a literal fairy tale about Cameron's potential future within Canva, she was appealing to something deeper than salary negotiations or equity discussions. She is offering him a hero's journey. And it worked. Cameron was charmed, intrigued, and ultimately convinced. He later goes on to say, "When I met Mel and Cliff, I could feel the jigsaw pieces coming together. The three of us had no idea how to run a company, but we could feel the jigsaw pieces coming together." But more than just being charmed by the presentation, Cameron recognizes that Melanie and Cliff had something he didn't: a deep understanding of the user experience problems in design software and the persistence to actually solve them. So Cameron joins as the third co-founder and chief product officer in June 2012. With his technical expertise, Melanie's vision, and Cliff's operational skills, they finally had the founding team they needed to build Canva. The fairy tale presentation had worked because it demonstrated several things about Melanie. She was creative, she was willing to take risks, she understood storytelling, and she cared enough about Cameron as a person to invest time and energy in making her pitch memorable and personal. So Cameron later explains, "I was building product, Cliff is the business operations lead, and Melanie's the one with product ideas and the vision. The roles were so well defined." Years later, reflecting on this moment, it's clear that this fairy tale moment with these Facebook pictures is more than just about recruiting a co-founder. It's about establishing a company culture where creativity, boldness, and personal connection would be valued over this conventional corporate behavior. And the woman who's learned how to kitesurf to access investors, who'd pitched with a paper deck tied with ribbon, was now using Facebook photos to recruit co-founders. You'll notice here that a pattern is emerging. Melanie is willing to do whatever it takes, no matter how unconventional, to build her vision. And with Cameron on board, they were finally ready to build Canva. But first, they had to decide exactly what Canva would be. Let's keep moving. Inflection point number 4 now. Let me paint you a picture of what it's like to be rejected 100 times. Not 100 applications sent into the void, not 100 emails that go unanswered, 100 face-to-face meetings where someone looks at you in the eye and says, "No, we don't believe in you. We don't think you can build this. We don't want to give you anything." It's 2011, and Melanie is living on her brother's apartment floor in San Francisco. Every morning she wakes up, checks her notes from the previous day's rejections, and prepares for another round of pitches. She's carrying that same paper pitch deck, now slightly worn from being pulled out of her bag dozens of times. The rejections come in many flavors, but they all sting. So Melanie shares this, and here are some of the common threads. "We need to be able to ride our bicycle to your office, and we can't really do that from Silicon Valley to Australia. The $8 million cap is above the top end of what we think is fair value. My biggest issue is physical distance. We've reached the conclusion that this isn't quite ready." And the classic one, "This isn't a good fit right now." Each no comes with feedback that makes the next pitch harder. Too big of an idea, too early, too risky, too complicated, too simple. The founders are in a romantic relationship, which is risky in and of itself. They're not technical enough, they're not American enough, and they're not Silicon Valley enough. But Melanie keeps going. Every rejection isn't failure. It's just information that gets you closer to where you want to go. And I think that's worth repeating. Every rejection isn't failure. It's just information that gets you closer to where you want to go. So she's incorporating all this feedback into the next pitch. She's learning the language of VC, understanding what investors care about, and refining her story with each conversation. And in between all these rejections, she's learning to kitesurf. What Melanie wants isn't just money. She wants believers. She needs investors who could see what she saw, that the entire design industry was built backwards, that complexity wasn't a feature, it was a design flaw, that the market for design tools wasn't limited to professional designers, it was everyone who'd ever wanted to communicate visually but felt blocked by the tools available to them. She wanted $3 million to build a technical team and create the platform she'd been envisioning. But more than that, she wants validation that her vision isn't crazy, that someone with experience in building large tech companies could look at her and say, "Yeah, I believe in you." Every pitch is an opportunity to find that person. Every meeting is a chance to connect with someone who understands that the most successful companies often come from solving problems that everyone else has learned to accept as just the way things are. But the math is working against her. The more investors who say no, the harder each subsequent pitch becomes. VCs talk to each other. When you're getting rejected consistently, it starts to feel like there might be something fundamentally wrong with your idea. This feedback isn't helping either. Investors are giving her contradictory advice. Make it smaller and more focused. and show us how this can be a billion-dollar business often came from the same meeting. You need a technical co-founder, and why don't you just hire developers? Were both common pushbacks. The personal toll was enormous. Melanie is naturally introverted, and all of this networking and pitching is exhausting. She later reflects on this. She goes, I'm an introvert, so networking is pretty daunting for me at the start, but is absolutely critical to get Canva off the ground. But maybe the most challenging thing is the opportunity cost. Every day she spends getting rejected in Silicon Valley is a day she's not growing Fusion Books. She's got a profitable business in Australia, but she's betting everything on this bigger vision. What if she's wrong? What if the investors were right? And design should just stay in the hands of professionals. Here's where Melanie's strategy proved its brilliance. She goes, each of these rejections taught us a lot. So over the years, we kept persevering. Every no becomes data about what investors care about, what objections she needs to address, and what parts of her pitch are unclear. More importantly, she's building her network through Bill Tye's global community. By learning to kitesurf, despite being terrified, she's gaining access to a group of entrepreneurs and investors who think differently than traditional VCs do. So again, Melanie reflects on this. She goes, I kind of needed to learn how to kitesurf. Kitesurfing scares the hell out of me, and learning to kitesurf in the dreary, cold, shark-infested waters of San Francisco is far from enjoyable. But I wanted to get Canva off the ground, so it was just a small inconvenience. I love that. Just a small inconvenience to learn how to kitesurf in shark-infested waters. This willingness to be uncomfortable, to do things that scare her in service of her vision, is becoming a pattern. Melanie is learning that entrepreneurship often requires you to become a person you never thought you could be. And I know if you're a founder listening to this, that applies so deeply to you. Let me say that again, that Melanie was learning that entrepreneurship often requires you to become a person you never thought you could be. So through this kitesurfing network, Melanie meets Lars Rasmussen, the co-founder of Google Maps. So you can tie this moment back to a previous inflection point where Melanie meets Cameron through Lars Rasmussen. Cameron's now on board, and the key turning point starts to manifest. The investor meetings start to go differently. They now have a technical co-founder with Google experience. They now have a clear division of responsibilities, and they have built Fusion Books to prove that they could execute on their vision. In 2012, they raised their first $3 million seed round, led by Matrix Partners in Australia, with matching funds from the Australian government. After more than 100 rejections, Melanie has finally found her believers. Again, these rejections are not failures. They are preparation. And every no makes the eventual yes more likely. I know that sounds so cliche and so fluffy, but you can see that every no is information that gets you closer towards where you want to go. So Melanie later reflects on this. She goes, we persevered over the years, but then eventually we raised our funding and we were extremely excited because all of a sudden we could start to grow our team. The girl who was living on her brother's floor, learning a sport that terrified her, pitching to anyone who would listen, finally assembles the team and resources she needs to build the future of design. But having the money was just the beginning. Now, she's got to actually build the thing. All right, last key inflection point here. We're going to jump forward quite a bit to 2019. At this point, Melanie's achieved something that would have satisfied most entrepreneurs for several lifetimes. Canva is valued at over $3 billion, making her one of the youngest female tech billionaires in history. She has tens of millions of users, hundreds of employees, and the kind of success that usually gets written about in business school case studies. But at this point, as she and Cliff are traveling through Cappadocia in Turkey, Melanie is about to make a decision that would define not just her personal life, but her entire philosophy about wealth, success, and responsibility. Picture the scene. The surreal landscape of Cappadocia, with its ancient cave churches carved into these rock formations and hot air balloons floating over volcanic valleys, is the kind of place that makes you think about what matters in life, about permanence and impermanence, and about what you leave behind. Cliff and Melanie have been together for over a decade at this point. They've built 2 companies together. They've survived 100 rejections together, and they've lived on floors and couches while chasing their dream. Their relationship has been forged through the unique pressures of entrepreneurship, the kind of shared struggle that either breaks couples apart or bonds them permanently. Now, Cliff is about to propose, but this isn't going to be a typical billionaire proposal. This isn't going to be some massive diamond, a fancy restaurant, or a hired photographer capturing a moment for social media. Instead, Cliff pulls out a $30 engagement ring. $30 for 2 people whose combined net worth is approaching $10 billion. What Melanie and Cliff want in that moment wasn't about the ring or even the proposal itself. It's about making a statement about their values, about who they are going to be as wealthy people, and how they're going to use their success. Cliff later explains this. He goes, "We don't really see the need to just accrue wealth. The priority for the company is education, because we really feel educating underprivileged people gives them the chance to break the cycle. They want their engagement to symbolize something important, that despite their enormous wealth, they weren't going to let money change their core values. The $30 ring wasn't about being cheap. It was about being intentional. It was about rejecting the assumption that expensive means meaningful. More broadly, they wanted to figure out how to use their wealth responsibly. As Melanie later puts it, this is a direct quote. She goes, "We had this wildly optimistic belief there is enough money, goodwill, and good intentions in the world to solve most of the world's problems. But here's the challenge that faces anyone who becomes extremely wealthy, especially at a young age. What do you do with more money than you could possibly spend in several lifetimes?" This isn't just a nice problem to have. It's actually a profound moral and practical challenge. Melanie and Cliff are in their early 30s, and they are already worth billions. If they did nothing but put their money in conservative investments, they become even wealthier every year for the rest of their lives. But how do you give away money more responsibly? How do you ensure that your philanthropy actually helps people rather than just makes you feel good about yourself? And how do you avoid the trap of wealthy people just throwing their money at problems they don't understand? There's also a personal conflict here. Melanie and Cliff had worked incredibly hard to build Canva. They'd sacrificed years of their lives, taken enormous risks, and persevered through countless setbacks. In some ways, they'd earned the right to enjoy their wealth, to buy nice things, and to live comfortably. The decision they made was radical, even by the standards of tech billionaires. They're going to give away the vast majority of their wealth, and they're going to do it while they were still young enough to be actively involved in how it was spent. So in 2021, Melanie and Cliff joined Warren Buffett's Giving Pledge, committing to donate at least half of their wealth to charitable causes during the lifetime or in their wills. But they went further than the minimum commitment. They're pledging 30% of their Canva stake, worth about $12 billion at the time, to the Canva Foundation, focused on alleviating global poverty through education. This wasn't money they planned to give away eventually. This was money that they could easily actively deploy within Canva. So Melanie later explains, "It never felt like our money in the first place. We've always felt that we're purely custodians of it. As we've previously shared, it's long been our intention to give the wealth away, and we've been thinking long and hard about the best way to start that journey." The $30 engagement ring had been a symbol of this philosophy. They weren't rejecting wealth. They were rejecting the idea that personal consumption should be tied to personal net worth. Taking a step back and thinking about the bigger picture, what's remarkable about all of this is how they approach philanthropy with the same methodical, user-focused thinking that built Canva in the first place. They don't just write checks. They research effective interventions, particularly focusing on education as a way to break cycles of poverty. Their approach reflects the same philosophy that built Canva. The $30 engagement ring has become a symbol of something much larger than just a personal relationship. It represents a philosophy about wealth, success, and responsibility that would influence how they ran their company and spent their money. So in January 2021, they marry on Rottnest Island off the coast of Perth. It's a simple ceremony that reflects their values about what really matters in life. Melanie later says, "We have this wildly optimistic belief that there is enough money, goodwill, and good intentions in the world to solve most of the world's problems. We feel like it's not just a massive opportunity, but an important responsibility, and we want to spend our lifetime working towards that." The same woman who started by watching students struggle with design software, who's lived on floors while chasing her vision, who has learned to kitesurf to access investors, was now using her billions to help people around the world access education and opportunity. The $30 ring was perfect because it represents exactly who Melanie and Cliff choose to be. People who measure success not by what they accumulate, but by what they enable others to achieve. You know, when I step back and I look at these 5 pivotal moments in Melanie's journey, some fascinating patterns emerge. These aren't just isolated decisions. They instead reveal a consistent way of thinking that I believe explains why she succeeds when so many others fail. So to start with, the most counterintuitive thread running through Melanie's story is how she achieved massive scale by starting impossibly small. So think about it. She wants to democratize design for everyone in the world. So by starting with yearbooks, she could prove every aspect of her thesis in a contained environment. Can you really make design collaborative? Yes. Students, teachers, and parents were successfully working together to create yearbooks. She's also thinking about whether you can make complex design tasks look simple. Well, yes to that too. People with zero design experience are creating professional-looking books. Most entrepreneurs make the mistake of trying to solve the biggest version of their problem first. But Melanie understands something profound. the best way to build something massive is first build something perfect. Fusion Books wasn't just a stepping stone to Canva, it was a lab where she could learn everything she needed to know about user experience, online collaboration, and the technical challenges of design software. When she finally launched Canva, she wasn't guessing about what users wanted. She already knew. The second pattern that I've observed when studying Melanie's story is how she consistently chooses discomfort over comfort as a strategy. So think about it, learning to kite surf when you're terrified of the sport, creating Facebook fairy tales where normal people would just send a professional email, pitching with paper decks when everyone uses professional looking slides, and even living on floors when you could stay in hotels. These aren't just random quirky acts. These are differentiators to stand out in crowded markets. When every entrepreneur is trying to look polished and professional, being genuinely human and vulnerable becomes your superpower. But more than just standing out, choosing discomfort gives Melanie access to the opportunities that comfort-seeking entrepreneurs miss. And think about it, the investors who loved kitesurfing, the co-founder who's charmed by unconventional recruiting, the meetings that happen because she's willing to get on a plane with no guarantee of success. I think there's something deeper here about entrepreneurship itself. Building something new requires you to become someone new. Melanie starts as this introverted design teacher, and she becomes someone who's comfortable pitching to the Silicon Valley elite. That transformation requires her to repeatedly choose growth over comfort. But perhaps the most remarkable thread that I observed in Melanie's story is how she reframes rejection from failure to education. Being on the receiving end of 100 no's would crush most people's spirits. I mean, think about walking into 100 job interviews and getting rejected from every single one of them. But Melanie treats each rejection as data about what investors cared about, what objections she needs to address, and what parts of her pitch need refining. Instead of Melanie asking, "Why isn't anyone funding me?" she goes, "What are these rejections teaching me about my business?" As you and I have already discussed, every no makes the eventual yes more likely because she is constantly improving her pitch, her business model, and her understanding of what investors wanted to see. By the time she finally raised funding, she has the most polished pitch deck and business plan in the world because she literally field tested it 100 times. I think there's something really powerful also in Melanie's story about how she views this technical complexity of the Adobe ecosystem, driving the need to build simple interfaces. Melanie understands something that most people miss. The best technology often appears the most simple to users. Building software that's easy to use is exponentially harder than building software that's complex to use. Adobe's tools are complex because they expose all their functionality directly to users. Canva's tools feel simple because enormous technical complexity is hidden behind these drag and drop interfaces. The paradox is that making things simple for users requires making things incredibly complex for engineers. That insight shapes everything about how she built Canva. She doesn't try to match Adobe feature for feature. Instead, she asks, what do 90% of people actually need to do? And then builds the most elegant solution for all those use cases. Finally, the common thread that strikes me most about Melanie's story is how consistently her decisions align with her values, even when those values seem irrational. Think about it, the $30 engagement ring, the giving pledge, the focus to democratize design rather than maximize your profit margins. These aren't afterthoughts once she becomes successful. They're core to how she thinks about business from the beginning. The same values that led her to want to help struggling design students also led her to give away billions to help struggling communities around the world. I think this consistency between personal values and business strategy is what makes truly great entrepreneurs different from merely successful ones. When your business is an expression of who you are rather than just what you do, you make different decisions. You're willing to sacrifice short-term profits for long-term impact, and you're willing to be vulnerable in ways that create deeper connections with customers, employees, and partners. And what I think is powerful for you is that these patterns are not just interesting, they are actionable. The next time you're facing a big challenge or opportunity, you can ask yourself, how can I start smaller to learn faster? What discomfort am I avoiding that might be actually a disadvantage? How can I treat being rejected 100 times as information rather than failure? And what would the simplest possible solution look like? In my opinion, all of these questions are powerful to ask yourself because they're the same ones that Melanie used to guide her to stratospheric success. Bringing this one to a close, what I keep thinking about as I reflect on Melanie's story is that computer lab in 2006 where a 19-year-old design teacher watched her students struggle with Photoshop and thought, there has to be a better way. That moment of frustration, something most of us would just accept and move on from, became the seed of a $40 billion company that has democratized design for hundreds of millions of people around the world. I think that's the real lesson here. The biggest opportunities often hide in the smallest frustrations. The problems that everyone has learned to accept as just the way things are, those are where fortunes are built and industries are transformed. Melanie doesn't have any special advantages. She's not a programmer. She's not from Silicon Valley. She doesn't have family money or prestigious connections. But what she does have is a willingness to see a problem differently and the persistence to do something about it. She was willing to start small, to be uncomfortable, to be rejected, to learn constantly, and to stay true to her values, even when it seemed economically irrational. These aren't like superhuman qualities. They are intentional choices, and they're choices that any of us can make. So the next time you find yourself frustrated with how something works, maybe ask yourself, what if this could be different? What would the simplest solution look like? And how could I test the idea in the smallest possible way? Or even, the next time you face rejection or setbacks, think, what is this teaching me? And how can I use this feedback to get better? I think there's a lot of powerful learnings here. Thank you for joining us on Inflection Moments. If today's episode sparked a new perspective or challenged your thinking, be sure to share it with someone you know who loves this stuff as much as you and I do. Maybe it's a college buddy, your water cooler buddy, or maybe even someone in the family group chat. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to leave a 5-star review and subscribe to our channels so you can be the first one to hear what we've got coming next. Until next time, keep building and talk soon.